Today's video is nothing but HOA madness and takedowns. Get ready for some satisfaction. Corrupt Condo Association counters change, posted by B26354. I purchased my townhouse in the late 2000s. The previous owners were motivated to sell for a good price. It was exactly what I wanted. 2 bedrooms, multiple bathrooms, and a garage. From the mandatory home inspection, I was told about several potential problems with the unit. Some were internal, and others dealt with an outside balcony, leaky windows, and cracked exterior paint. Before finalizing the sale, I was given the opportunity to ask about these issues and was told that I was responsible for everything inside the townhouse and the outside problems were handled by the condo association, and I just had to submit requests for repair. The condo association fee was very cheap for this area, so I considered that a plus. I closed on the sale and I moved in without any problems. The total number of units in the complex is about 130, so it's a decent size. Some have like 2 bedrooms, some 3, and only a few, like mine, have garages with exterior balconies on them. When I moved in, I was presented with a list of the association's bylaws for the property. Nothing major, most were what you'd expect, like keeping your entryway clean, dogs on leashes, guest parking, and such. There was a 1 pet limit that I could see everyone was ignoring, so I saw that they were a bit lenient with the rules. I became friends with a neighbor and she told me that the association was slow to handle problems. In fact, most of the units, conjoined in groups of 6 or more, were in dire need of new paint. Almost every unit had problems with their windows, but the association was only replacing windows on the backs of the units and only a handful at a time. The association's communication was pretty poor. We'd get infrequent newsletters, but they had an underlying tone of, "We'll get to your issues when we can, no sooner than we feel like." They would also announce condo association board elections, but there seemed to be little interest, so they would appoint other owners to the board as needed. About 2 years in, I got a printed newsletter from an owner in the complex, who we'll call Mike, claiming the board is ignoring the owners. It detailed a few things that weren't being addressed, like the paint in the windows, and the owner protests were being ignored. The board wasn't even holding annual open user meetings, which are specified in the association bylaws. Those meetings were also for holding elections of new board members. The letter demanded a change in the situation. Enter Karen. Not her actual name, but it rhymes with Karen. She was the association's treasurer on the board. She was controlling the board, and her word was apparently, quote, law, unquote. That newsletter specifically called for her to step down. Next thing we know, there's an official association newsletter mailed to us that calls the owner's newsletter a complete fabrication and claimed Mike had ulterior motives. There was nothing to address the problems that Mike mentioned. It was just a generalized attack on him. Mike was initially asking for access to the association's books, and the association refused to show them to him. This is guaranteed in the association's bylaws. We received another newsletter detailing this and how he was going to take them to court if he was continually blocked. Another response from the association was mailed, but it was just attacking Mike and questioning his motives. I was visited by another neighbor who was circulating a petition demanding change, and I gladly signed it. Nothing was being done, aside from standard groundskeeping and the occasional emergency repair. We received a few more newsletters from Mike and several rebuttals from the association. Mike successfully sued to have access to the books. And from the newsletters, he reported that what he saw was just a list of code numbers, not names and dollar amounts for payouts. There was no way to really know who was receiving the money or why. Somewhere in all of these newsletters, it was revealed that Karen, who was an accountant, was being paid by the association for her time. Well, she's an accountant. Mike's newsletters also revealed that Karen chose the maintenance company, which was managed by Marin, Karen's sister. Wow, what a surprise. Not. The situation was getting worse. Tensions were high. Somewhere in here, the association mailed out a newsletter that claimed all the rebuttals they were mailing out were costing them a lot of money, more like $50 if you consider the postage, and it had to stop. Also, they announced that they were accepting candidates for the new election, and the form had to be mailed back in by a certain date. It was a step in the right direction, but I soon realized that we received the newsletter on a Saturday and the deadline for submitting was the following Tuesday. Karen could easily claim that no one had sent in their forms by the deadline. Other owners told me that she'd been doing this trick for years so she could appoint anyone that she wanted to the board. The association was using a P.O. box, and the only way to get an application in on time was to go to the post office where the box was on Monday and send a certified letter to prove that it was received in time. Fat chance. Mike and his friends had hand-delivered those newsletters. One time, I saw someone walking around the complex delivering the newsletter. I went down to retrieve it from my mailbox right away. But I also noticed that Karen was going to every mailbox, pulling these newsletters out and was throwing them into the garbage as she went. I heard her say something like it wasn't legally mailed. After that event, Mike sued to force a proper election, and the judge ordered it. For the election, we had to have a 2/3 owner majority present, either by attendance or by signed proxy. On the day of the election, many of us arrived at the meeting, and we noticed a security guard was standing by Karen, who was checking everyone in and giving them a ballot. She was expecting trouble. I heard her tell people they couldn't vote because they were in arrears with their monthly dues, had outstanding fines, or were told they weren't the official owner of record. She disqualified many people. Now, there were some arguments, but the security guard kept things civil. Note that our bylaws don't say anything about who can and can't vote, aside from the owner on record. On top of that, only a couple of candidates made it onto the ballot, excluding Mike and several others who had definitely applied. The meeting started with Karen giving some general information, and the members were talking amongst themselves a lot. Many were PO'd about being refused a ballot, and others were complaining about all the candidates missing from the ballot. One of the last bits of information was that Karen announced that she would refuse any future letters sent by certified mail because it required someone to go to the post office and acknowledge delivery on a certain date. She would normally get the mail whenever she felt like it. Karen was trying to circumvent the law by conveniently ignoring timely letters like candidate applications and our monthly dues. Some owners brought up the possibility of re-entering Mike and the other candidates onto the ballot as write-ins, and the crowd voted with him, but the board refused to recognize the vote. Lastly, the votes were collected and counted, but the board president announced that they didn't have a 2/3 majority, so the election would be canceled. We were only short a few people. The number of people Karen didn't give ballots to would have tipped the balance. Surprise! The board quickly adjourned the meeting and left before people realized what was happening. That was a fun night. No one was happy. Mike was paying out of his own pocket for his lawyer, and it was getting expensive. I heard the number $20,000 mentioned. People did help defray the cost by donating to the cause, though. Mike was not done. He went back to court another time to sue for a legal election. There was nothing in the bylaws that denied voting rights for past due balances, and Karen lied about at least one owner not being the owner of record. Armed with that information, the judge ordered another election to be supervised by an independent third-party lawyer. As I recall, the association's lawyer quit because they kept going against his advice. They replaced him with a yes man. The third-party lawyer was in complete charge of the election, including collecting candidate applications. A reasonable deadline for applications was set, 2 weeks, and proxy ballots were sent out as well. Karen's position was up for election, as were 2 other positions. We found out that the board president was appointed by Karen, but he was not an owner and had to step down. Only owners can serve on the board. Finally, the election came, and pretty much everyone showed up or had provided proxy votes. There was definitely a 2/3 majority present, not including proxy votes. The lawyer called for 3 volunteers from the owners to count the ballots. The results were that 4 new people joined the board that night. They had gotten around 80 to 90 votes each. Another active board member got 17 votes, and Karen got 15 or something like that. We presume her votes were all proxy votes. I was wondering if they were going to go after Karen for getting paid and cooking the books, but the new treasurer received everything with proper records, names this time and not numbers. The maintenance company was tossed out almost immediately. Karen sold her unit and moved to Florida, but not before arranging for some exterior beautification around her unit, complete with plant boxes, flowers, and shrubs. We think she saw the writing on the wall and moved out before any backlash could occur. The association's lawyer was also replaced. Then came the bad news. The association had to pay out almost $50,000 in legal fees to fight against Mike in his lawsuits. Since the association was paying for the lawyer, we couldn't put the bill on Karen. What a pity! We later discovered that the long-term project fund used for major upkeep of the complex was pretty badly depleted and needed to be refilled. Our lawyer advised us that for the size of the complex, it needed to be over $2 million, but there was less than $1 million in the fund. Fortunately, they didn't demand assessments, but instead raised the monthly dues to start making up the difference. In the 15 years I've been here, the dues went from $150 to $375 and go up annually now. Karen had ignored many of the longer-term projects, and in the next 2 to 3 years, the buildings were repainted, the roofs were reshingled, bad windows were replaced, and all the balconies were completely rebuilt. In more recent years, our insurance company demanded we repave the roadway because it was falling apart in places. They wouldn't insure it unless that was done immediately. These days, we have a better and more responsive maintenance company and a Facebook page for general announcements and chit-chat. There are no real winners in this case, but after all of the required improvements were done, most of us feel better living here than during the dark time of Karen's reign. My HOA are incompetent scum. My father stalks them until they resign. Takedown posted by a Zuriach hermit. So I live in a relatively new suburban neighborhood with a homeowners association, an HOA, that has been slowly getting more annoying. My father, a paranoid, vengeful Republican retired civil engineer, is the main disperser of the revenge. Here's a list of their earlier offenses. About 5 years ago, they sent us a notice to move our garbage bins out of the street, and if they were left outside of the backyard after garbage day for too long again, they would fine us. Our garbage bins were not in the street. We were also very good about putting our garbage bins away promptly after they sent us a warning after we left them out during a week-long vacation. They somehow mixed up our house with our neighbors. My dad spray painted our lot number on the bins so that this wouldn't happen again. The rest of the neighborhood slowly followed suit. From what I hear, the security guard the HOA hired is also paid to look for infractions on each lot, but apparently is not paid enough to get the lot numbers right, so this happened several times. The light on our address number hasn't worked since the house was built, and we bought immediately after it was finished, because the construction job was rather shoddy. 6 years later, somebody from the HOA finally noticed and told us that we had to pay to fix it, even though it was due to an electrical fault on the part of the builders. They also demanded a picture to prove that we fixed it. My father opened the box where the light was, put a glow stick in, and took a picture at night and then sent it in, the address light seemingly fixed. They bought it. They even tried to force all members of the neighborhood into this poorly designed social network for our neighborhood. Nobody liked it, and the network was barely even used by the HOA. Not announcing HOA meetings except a day or two before the meeting by posting the times on the dilapidated board at the park at the center of the neighborhood. The paper often falls off and blows away, so the meetings were not often attended by anybody until recently because of the big offense that follows. Here's the big one that set my dad off. There is apparently a clause in the HOA guidelines that, every so often, we must have the house repainted. The first time to do this came up last year. There was a lot of crappy bureaucracy involved, like having to submit a request to do the mandated painting. And then the whole neighborhood was mandated to use these expensive, not particularly good paints that couldn't be bought anywhere nearby except from a posh, overpriced supplier some 100 miles away. My father, being a cheapskate, said screw that, and he got a small-time guy, real friendly, to do the job on the cheap and use paints that were one tone off, but were more durable and cheaper because they could be bought in bulk from the big store down the street. He does a great job in just 2 hot summer days, doing all the work with just him and, I believe, 2 others, all on the cheap. A few months later, when everybody else was repainting their houses, we get a notice that our house is not painted according to code and submit a new request to repaint our house or face penalties. My dad was steaming because he was pretty sure the only reason they required us to use those colors was because the paint company was paying them to, and the house looked great. He endured months of poorly managed bureaucracy. He kept sending the request to repaint the house, and they kept playing around, losing the request, not keeping him notified of the matter, delaying the processing until it neared the deadline to paint the house. If we overshot the deadline, we would be fined. He demanded that they just fine him, bribe, for using the wrong paint and not force him to repaint with the overpriced crappy paint. They wanted to make an example of us and have him come before a disciplinary committee, and my father wouldn't let this stand. While they kept playing bureaucratic games, my father started his revenge games. He got somebody in the HOA to tell him where the offices of their management was, and he went there to demand to speak with them, to complain, and ask for information on the proceedings. Because it was so far out of the way and hard to figure out where it was, and he made such a fuss, they panicked. He went again a week later, and they had beefed up security and denied him entry unless he had an appointment. When he met with the disciplinary committee, there was an armed security guard there. My father pulled out all of his know-how as a civil engineer and told them that the paint they were using was subpar, overpriced, and it was clear that they had no experience in the field and needed a consultant. They politely declined his services and tried to get him to pin all the blame on the painter, which he refused to do as he authorized the painter to cheap out on the paint. As punishment, they forced us to repaint in a different, much uglier color that's completely out of place for the neighborhood and was apparently designed for a completely different location. We give in, but my father won't let this go without them knowing never to screw with him again. He starts calling and emailing them regularly to demand to know when the next HOA meeting is and berate them for not properly notifying the neighborhood by email or even regular mail and newsletters. Pretty sure this is a violation of their regulations, but they might be just barely fulfilling them with the half-butt posting the day before the meetings mentioned earlier. He then starts attending every meeting and recording them. I join him and I pretend to be unrelated to make it appear that more people were upset with them. Turns out they've been ticking people off all over the neighborhood, including refusing to let a family dispose of a diseased tree ruining their lot. I don't recall all the details, but I think the tree wasn't actually on their property, but rather an empty lot or a condemned lot next door, but it was damaging their garden and property. Doing nothing to deal with a hornet nest on a block set of mailboxes. The mailboxes are all set up in one conjoined block of boxes. That was causing the mail person to refuse to deliver the mail there, causing people to miss bills and important mail. forcing at least 2 other houses who did the same as us to repaint in those crappy colors. My dad met with these people, and he gathered their contact info. We had planned to organize with other angry neighbors to stage a coup once elections came around. After the first meeting, my father took the information he'd gathered on the people in charge of the HOA, took to the internet, and found much more. The second meeting he goes to, he shows with name placards for all of them, so that the neighborhood could know not only their names and positions, they couldn't be bothered to do this themselves, but also their addresses and phone numbers, letting them know he knows who they are and where they live. This, on top of his harassment by email and phone and their office, to the point that they had hired security guards to protect them from an angry old gun-owning man, must have been too much for this group of 30-something soccer moms. The next meeting, there's new HOA people. The president, vice president, and half the board have resigned. Turns out they were all a clique that used the HOA as more of a social club than a serious thing. My father is satisfied, and the new board starts taking action to actually help people in the neighborhood. Commenter says, your dad should start a business called HOA Busters, where he goes to a neighborhood that's being terrorized and gets them to resign or vote out. He could also have people filming him. I would watch that show. My HOA experience, posted by Lil Bit Evil. I'm a 41-year-old male. At an experienced age of 25 years and a bachelor, I grew tired of living in a low-rent apartment surrounded by less than lawful individuals and decided that a mortgage at the time would be only a little more per month and would make a great investment. Oh, to go back in time and give myself a talk, because what I learned was that living in an HOA only makes you a glorified renter. At the end of the day, you own nothing. The condo I purchased was very nice. 1,300 square foot, 3-bedroom, 2-bath, vaulted ceilings, thick walls. I was pretty impressed with myself. Unfortunately, the HOA was not well managed. The board was nothing more than puppets for the management company, who might as well have been the landlord. It was a large HOA, 26 buildings with 12 units each. I learned in comparison to friends that this was a good thing, as it meant assessment fees were more spread out. When I moved in, I didn't know about assessment fees, and I was barely educated on the HOA fee. One of the selling points was the low HOA fee, only $80 a month. But later I found out that the developer, who was still finishing the last 4 buildings, supplemented the fee to keep it low so he could sell more units. I also didn't know that my HOA was a sub-HOA, which means that it was an HOA inside of an HOA. So I had to pay the master HOA another $25 a month to do nothing at all, literally nothing but the privilege of living in an HOA that was part of a collection of other HOAs. The sub-HOAs did all the internal maintenance, and the city itself took care of the HOA communal areas like the public roads. Meanwhile, my sub-HOA board was full of out-of-state South Californians in a snow-heavy state. My first year there, they budgeted $2,000 for snow removal and $45,000 for beautification, which was like new wood chips and remodeling the clubhouse. Meanwhile, the snow removal fee came to $35,000. At the HOA meeting to vote on how to pay this $35,000 snow fee, they banned anyone from talking about how we got into that mess and how anyone who did it was arrested for disorderly conduct by the police standing by, on request of the management company. Eventually, they voted on an assessment fee which came to about $350-ish for each unit. Later I learned the plow company was owned by the management company owner's relative. That plow guy came out if there was barely a visible frost on the ground and charged us $100 per push every time he backed up and drove forward. Eventually, the HOA board was replaced, and they replaced the management company with a new company. The new company liked to play with the pool keys and charge you to turn them back on. They always tried to claim your card was read at the pool during an unauthorized time, or that card that you were using was a fake that they didn't issue. The 2008 recession hit without selling the last of the units. The developer backed out of supplementing the fees, and the fee jumped $65 and then $10 the next year. Probably even higher later, but I moved out. The developer screwed up and didn't have room to give the last building or so their 2 parking spots, which one was covered. So now the HOA wanted to revoke everyone's second spot. Problem, the second spot was on my mortgage and bylaws provided for a second spot. The HOA dropped the revoked spot idea, but I do not know how they eventually solved it. Last, I overpaid my HOA every month for dues, placing me several hundred over as insurance against the next assessment fee. So I paid a little amount for the HOA to install a screen on my dryer vent to keep the birds out against my credit. I also paid for several upgrades inside to sell the place. Unfortunately, when I tried to sell, the recession was at its worst, and I sold at a loss to get out of there and buy a house. The last insult of this HOA was to claim that I never paid for the screen on my dryer vent and that I owed a few hundred in back HOA fees. If I didn't pay, they would place a lien on me, which would mess with the condo I sold and the house I was buying. So I paid the ransom and I walked away from that dumpster fire. The good news is the house I bought was no HOA and has tripled in value. I do know the master HOA was eventually sued by all the sub-HOAs and dissolved because they did nothing but rent an office down the street. I've also ran into people who still own in my old sub-HOA, and yes, the fee is now much higher. HOA secrets exposed, tax evasion, fraud, and extortion, how I uncovered it. Find out how by clicking on the video on the screen. You don't want to miss this story, and I will see you there.